These two slides replace the lecture in week 8 and give you some additional background to the topics of both week 7 and week 8 that the week 7 lecture didn't manage to cover. It also builds on the discussion that we had in the tutorial during the exercise that we did that focuses on the disproportionate incarceration and policing of Black people and ethnic minorities, particularly Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in Australia, and then moves on to look at the concept known as the prison industrial complex, which is your topic for week 8. So, as we already spoke last week, the US has long been acknowledged as having the highest rate of incarceration among Black people and ethnic minorities. But in fact, when it comes to the incarceration and policing of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in Australia, the disproportionality is even more extreme than it is in the US. And these charts reveal this. The recent revelations of the extent of violence and degradation at the Dondale Youth Detention Facility in the Northern Territory, as well as at Cleveland Youth Detention Centre in Townsville, among other places, shows the disproportionate criminalisation and subsequent harsh treatment of young Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander detainees in particular. And you'll remember that our exercise last week revealed that if you are a juvenile person of an Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander background, you are 32 times more likely to end up in jail than young people from the population at large. Just looking at some facts and figures now, these are by no means exhaustive, but just to give you a further indication of the stark contrast, when we look at the percentage of Aboriginal prisoners in Australia, just to take 2008 as an indicative number, 28% of the prisoners in the whole country are Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander. When we're looking at juveniles in particular, that rises to 61% when we're looking at the category of juveniles. In 2012, as we saw last week, the rate of imprisonment of Indigenous offenders was 19 times higher at 2,302 per 100,000 of the population than for the majority of, or for non-Indigenous people, where the rate was 124 per 100,000, meaning that you are 19 times more likely to go to jail if you are Indigenous than if you are non-Indigenous. The imprisonment rate for Aboriginal women has increased enormously between 2000 and 2010 by 60% in fact. And if you compare that to the figure that we had in our exercise last week, where we looked at the general increase in the prison population over the last 10 years, we saw that there was an increase of 10%. However, when we isolate Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women, that is 60%. Now, obviously, we need to compare this to the number of Aboriginal people in the total population, and as we discussed last week, they make up around 2.5% of the population. So they are grossly overrepresented in the criminal justice system, which is something that has started to be discussed, particularly in light of the revelation of the treatment of juveniles in places like Dondale and Cleveland. Now, if we look at this in global comparison, for example, in the UK, Black prisoners make up 15% of the prisoner population. So comparing that to 28% among Aboriginal people in Australia. And again, this compares with their existence in the general population, meaning that they make up 2.2% of the general population. So there's still an enormous disproportionality there. America jails 3% of its Black population, and in total, England and Wales incarcerates 1% of its Black population. As the race scholar and former Black Panther Angela Davis points out, in order to be able to reach such numbers, the imprisonment of Black people and ethnic minorities relies on racialized assumptions about Black people's greater likelihood to commit crime. Because it is believed that Black people are naturally more inclined to commit crime, locking them up is seen as the simplest solution. And we discussed this last week when we talked about the prevalence of genetically deterministic ideas about whether or not a group of people can ever be reformed. there is a generalized belief, especially in societies like the US, like Australia in relation to its indigenous population, and in the UK, that groups, racialized groups in society simply cannot be reformed, and that there is a natural inclination to more criminality within that group. Now, from a sociological perspective, we would argue that this was anti-sociological because it doesn't look for the underlying social, political, and economic reasons for why why you may have more crime among a certain group, but also the reasons for which some groups are more targeted by the police and more likely to be placed under arrest and imprisoned. So combined with the need for greater prison numbers to fuel the prison industry, as we'll see in a minute, locking black people up is often seen as a solution for politicians who are keen to be seen as being tough on crime, and for an industry that relies on the very existence of criminals to be incarcerated. Without criminals being in jail, no money is to be made in the prison industry. As Loic Vacan shows for the case of Brazil, the racialization of crime in prisons is also highly prevalent there. In the mid-1980s, 7 out of 10 prisoners in Rio were Afro-Brazilians. Behind bars, it is these prisoners who face the harshest detention conditions and the most violence. Now, thinking about the social consequence of the mass incarceration of black people, for example, in the US, as Angela Davis says, this mass incarceration masks other social problems. Politicians are able to say that they have solved the problem of unemployment, for example, in certain areas, not because suddenly you see full employment, but because the problem has been taken away by imprisoning large numbers of the employable population. So by sending people to jail for smaller and smaller crimes, you can claim to have dealt with the fact that there is unemployment in society by simply taking those unemployable people, if you like, out of the equation. Under these conditions, it is argued, reform is futile because there is no agenda to bring young black men out of prison and into gainful employment. In the US in particular, Angela Davis argues, there is an absence of jobs, an absence of social welfare, and an absence of political will to see these people as anything other than a menace to society. And I think when we talk about the link between Aboriginal incarceration and unemployment and the connection of that to debates around welfare in Australia, we could see very similar patterns to the types of things that Angela Davis is pointing out. I want to introduce the notion of the prison industrial complex, and instead of talking about it at length myself, I'm going to use an interview with one of the longest held black prisoners in the United States, Mumia Abu-Jamal, who until recently was on death row, but has actually had his conviction changed to life imprisonment. The emergence of what has come to be known as the prison industrial complex is one of the fundamental features of what Loic Vacan has called neoliberal penality. According to Julia Sudbury, in addition to the common sense connection made between poverty and crime and the increasing racialization of crime, the approach taken to crime today is marked by what she calls the symbiotic relationship between state correctional institutions, politicians, and the corporate sector. I'm going to quickly play this video by Mumia Abu-Jamal before concluding with some remarks about his words.
How do you role of prisoners in society?
Well, remember back then when we were young, and we was back during the Vietnam War, we used to talk about the military-industrial complex. Well, now you have the prison-industrial complex. And you have what is the ultimate solution to America's economic problem. Those who are poor, those who are powerless, those who have no access to the wealth that one needs to survive, and perhaps wealth isn't, but the resources one needs to survive. In an area where there is corporate downsizing and there are no jobs and there is only a service economy and education being cut, which is the only rung by which people can climb. The only growth industry in this part of Pennsylvania, in the eastern United States, in the southern United States, in the western United States, is quote-unquote correction, for one of a better word. The corrections industry is booming. And this joint here ain't 5 years old. Some corporations made a mint off of this thing. This thing cost millions of dollars to be built and constructed. But second to that, you have across the United States for the first time in modern history, you have small rural counties and districts begging the government, build a prison here, please. There was a time when it was, not in my backyard. You better not. I don't want that here. But now they're talking about, jobs. That's the reality. That's the reality that we're working with. And of course, blacks, Latinos, Hispanics, Mexicans in the West, and Puerto Ricans in the East, and so-called white trash, poor whites, are the raw material now. We're like the hamburgers in McDonald's. We're the raw material now. We're being fed into this. And what you see in Congress and what you see in state houses are the greasing of the conveyor belt on that, that meat patty line. Because there are no laws anymore. Think about it. When you look at the trend of the law, and analyze the cases, read the cases, and see what they're saying, you don't hear anybody talking about, search and seizure, Fourth Amendment, or any other amendment. What you hear in popular discourse on talk radio stations or in the newspaper is lock them up yesterday, or kill them. You see? And it becomes a political, again, an engine feeding an industry, the prison industrial complex, you see. And it is so naked now, so negative now, that as Monica said, you can have over 1.1 million people in this prison, in these prisons. And you have people saying, well, they need to lock up more people. You have people actually saying, of course they don't know what they're talking about, but they're just following a script that has been laid down, by the media, by the politicians. When you spoke about, that, I thought about a recent article that was in the New York Times. You may have seen it by Saul Watler, who used to be the presiding chief judge of the New York Court of Appeals. And I laughed when I read it. I had a belly laugh. Because here was a guy who was, for all intents and purposes, a hanging judge. And if somebody, made a claim before his court, well, you get nothing. Shot people down like, it was fun. But in his article, he talked about the difference between reading a brief about an inmate who sued about the humiliation of strip search and going through that experience himself. And how devastated he was by it. But every one of those 1.1 million people, and increasingly, when you look at least across the country now, you don't have to go to prison to go through that humiliation. You go to your average police station down the block. Someone gets arrested for a traffic violation, a ticket. And men and women are being strip searched in every city of America. You see what I'm saying? So, when he was in a position of power, and he could have said, this is unconstitutional, or it violates the things. Doesn't make a claim. Next, denied. And he didn't sense how wrong, how cold-hearted that was until it was him that had to spread his buttocks. It was him who had to pull his penis back. You understand what I'm saying? It became a whole other reality. You know, Jamaicans are the same. Who feels it knows it. Well, now he knows it. A little too late though.
Mumia Abu Jamal's life is valuable to all human life. Mumia Abu Jamal's life is valuable to this earth. Mumia Abu Jamal's wisdom, his knowledge is valuable to our offspring, to the young, to the unborn. We gotta free Mumia Abu Jamal, brick by brick, wall by wall. We have to free Mumia Abu Jamal. Let's send a message May 17th.
Okay, so in this video, Mumia Abu Jamal is making the link really between the prison industrial complex, the industry around incarceration, and the spread of penal culture, if you like, to wider swathes of society. So when he talks about the average police station being sites of violence against ordinary people, we can see the replication of the same kind of logic of violence that exists within the incarceration system, which arguably is compounded through the privatization of prisons, in which you have less oversight over the treatment of prisoners than you have in state-controlled institutions. And that's something that comes across quite strongly in the Shane Bauer reading, where you see the overlap, the cultural overlap between those who work as prison guards, many of whom have either served time themselves or who have family members who have served time, and those who are considered inmates. It's interesting to note the recent announcement, as I said last week, by Obama that private prisons at federal level will close in the US. But the critique that was made by activists that most private prisons are in fact not run at federal level, but are state or county level prisons and therefore don't fall within the remit of this law. It'll be interesting what this means, however, for organizing around incarceration and mass incarceration in the United States. Activists have noted that because there's been a tendency to release prisoners from incarceration, that there's been a spread of control orders and similar forms of electronic tagging and so on within society, so that you curb people's possibility to live freely in society even when they are not in fact imprisoned in an actual jail. So this is through, for example, keeping people in house arrest or placing them with electronic tags, forcing them to report daily to police and so on and so forth. So there's been a kind of a spread of the culture, as I said before, of penalty throughout society. Now, thinking about Australia, it's very interesting to look at where the similarities and differences lie. One of the things that's completely obvious is that Australia has gone very far down the road of private prisons. For those of you who are particularly interested in this topic, I would recommend following the Facebook page Serco Watch. Serco is a private company, a global company that has a huge participation in the private prison industry across the world. It's also been involved in asylum detention centers and currently is involved in a number of prisons throughout Australia and likely to get more and more involved in it as time goes on. Making a brief connection, which we'll take up again in week 11, to asylum detention centres. As I mentioned in class, the offshore detention centres on Nauru and in Manus Island are both run by a private company, a company that used to be called Transfield, which is a large infrastructure company, which later was forced to change its name due to protest to Broad Spectrum, and which recently has been taken over in a takeover bid by a Spanish multinational company called Ferrovial. And Ferrovial has already announced that it will not be continuing its operation in Manus Island and in Nauru due to the economic impact of that toxic involvement by Transfield previously, leading to them having been forced to sell their shares and be bought over by Ferrovial. Yesterday, Wilson Security, which is the company that Transfield Broadspectrum had outsourced the security of the 2 offshore detention centres, announced that it too will no longer be working in that sphere. However, if we look closely at what's happening, you see Broadspectrum now getting the contract to take over prisoner transport in Western Australia, meaning that these companies may be getting out of a controversial system such as the offshore detention system, which is certainly very interesting in terms of what will happen to Australia's migration policy, but nonetheless are not leaving the prison industry in general, simply reorienting where they carry out those activities. So one of the things we'll be doing in week 11 is revisiting the question of the prison industrial complex as it relates particularly to the imprisonment of asylum seekers in detention.